begin a new series, a series that we're calling Sacred Space. And we're calling it Sacred Space for this reason, because this is what Lent is primarily about in so many ways. It's a time to clear some space, some holy space, some sacred space. It's this time to clear some space in our lives so that, simply put, we might be able to sense God better. We might be able to hear him better, see him better. And so with that in mind, thinking along those lines, here's the image we're going to be working with over these next 6 weeks. The image of wilderness. Or more specifically, hopefully with some courage, we'll begin to explore together actually the image of our own personal wilderness. And that being our focus, let me just say this. Guys, the key to getting the most out of this image is really just this: having the courage. And that's what it takes oftentimes, because we're talking about being willing to enter into the pain, the hurt, the struggle, the times when we know we've sinned against neighbor and God. We're talking about a place where it's hard to enter into. To get the most out of this imagery, the wilderness, we got to simply have the courage to enter into that place in our lives so that we might begin to do what? So that we might now begin to work on, with God's help, the things that we'll find there, those places in our lives that need healing, that need help, that need the care that only God can bring. Our core passage for today truly is such an important passage when it comes to this season we enter into, because it really lays a foundation for everything that is to come. We're going to turn today to Mark chapter 1, starting with verse 9. Any of you who want to follow along in your Bibles, if you want to pull that up on your phone, again, we're going to turn to Mark chapter 1, and we'll read verses 9 through 13. Mark 1, 9 through 13. Here's what we find there. It says, "At that time, Jesus came from Nazareth in Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan. Just as Jesus was coming up out of the water, he saw heaven being torn open and the Spirit descending upon him like a dove." We continue, verse 11, "And a voice came from heaven saying, 'You are my Son whom I love. With you I am well pleased.' At once the Spirit sent him into the wilderness, and he was in the wilderness for 40 days, being tempted by Satan. He was with the wild animals, and angels attended to him." And because this is just such a focus for us today, I want you to hear again these verses, the words that we find in verse 12. It says, "The Spirit immediately sent him out into the wilderness," or the New Revised Standard Version says it this way. I think this is even stronger. "The Spirit immediately drove him." Not just sent him and said, "Have a good time," but drove him in, knowing that even for Jesus, this wasn't what was planned. Again, one of the things that's inferred here, that's implied here when we read that, is just that. Jesus wasn't planning on this. This wasn't a part of his journey. I'll be baptized, I'll hear God say incredible things about me, right? And then I'm going to head into a time of testing and struggle and temptation, right? Wasn't a part of his plan. In fact, in that moment, probably having heard those words from God, in that moment, probably the human side of him was saying, "Okay, let's go. I want to start my ministry. I need to begin to teach and preach and heal and help. I don't really have time for anything else, so let's go." And yet, even though that probably was his mindset, again, human side of Jesus, we can't ever forget that side. Even though that might have been his mindset, what does the Spirit do? The Spirit drives him into the wilderness anyway. So first we have that, but then we also have this, and this is just another key part of this experience for Jesus. First we have the Spirit driving him there, but then we also have these words, he was in the wilderness for 1 day, for 2 days. No, he was in the wilderness for 40 days. Meaning this wasn't a momentary kind of thing, was it? We got to pay attention to that. Instead, here was this critical time of reflection for Jesus that was even lengthy, we might say. And again, here was this critical time of reflection for Jesus that even, we need to say, was required of him. Think of that. Before he ever started his earthly ministry. So using this passage as our foundation today, here's what we want to do. We want to now begin to explore our personal wilderness. We see Jesus moving into that, and now we want to just begin to explore together. So what does my wilderness look like? You know, this place of struggle, this place of pain, this place this place where we desperately need God at work. We want to talk about today, what does that look like for us? Begin to move into that. Now to do that and to do that really well, let's come back to Jesus' experience for a moment, because it's really important for us to see the movement here, to see the flow here, meaning as soon as Jesus hears this incredible call from God, as soon as Jesus hears these amazing words, you know what they would have sounded like to you. Same for him. You are my son whom I love. With you I am well pleased. As soon as Jesus hears this, experiences this, again, is probably ready to head into ministry, wants to. As soon as Jesus experiences all of that, what comes next? It says immediately, Spirit drives him into the wilderness. And why in the world would that be the case? Only one reason, right? God clearly knew Jesus, even Jesus, needed this time in order to more and more, think about the human side, in order to more and more make his will God's will. He needed this time, God knew, in order to just in a deeper way come to give his whole self to this God who created him for a reason. And wouldn't you agree, if even Jesus needed that, you with me? If even Jesus needed that, this time of struggle and testing and reflection in the wilderness, if even Jesus needed that, then of course we need it as well. And so today, as we kick things off, here's what we're going to work on. Again, trying to better understand, so what does my wilderness look like? And I hope as we explore this, I hope some of you print it out or you'll do it later, the reflection notes that relate to the sermon. As we go deeper into, okay, what does this wilderness look like for me? Struggle, pain, just all of that. First, we want to come to better understand, what does that look like for us personally? It'll be different for all of us. But then we also want to better understand this. Okay, what are some of the big things, though, that all of us will find there? What are some of the things that we'll definitely find there? And it's helpful to think about those even now so that what? So that we'll be better prepared to deal with them, to learn from them, better prepared to give them to God. And so with that in mind, consider a few thoughts today. Here's the first, and before I offer the first, Tim, I'm going to take my mask off. I meant to do that earlier. I'm wearing it with you guys. I found when I started looking at it's such vanity, isn't it? I found that when I started watching these online, this just doesn't, it's okay in here. We're a long way away from each other. I didn't think it translated very well. So thank you for pausing for a moment. With that in mind, what's our wilderness look like? What are we going to find there? With that in mind, a couple of thoughts today. Here's the first. First off, and Jesus certainly found this to be true, first off, our wilderness, the wilderness in our lives, is a place that's pretty uncomfortable, right? It's not very comfortable. It's not a place that a lot of times we want to enter into because of that. Truth is, when it comes to some of the most difficult places in our lives, we want to avoid them. Talk about not just the human side of us, but being fully human. What do we do oftentimes because we want to avoid these difficult places in our lives? We pretend like they don't exist. We pretend like, even though we see this as an example with Jesus, we pretend like there is no wilderness in us. No failure, no struggle, no weakness. And while that sometimes works for us in the short term, and it can, man, in the long run, if we cling to that kind of deceit, not just trying to deceive God, but also self, if we cling to that for very long, that will always simply lead us to heartache. And so first off, knowing that entering into our wilderness is going to be very uncomfortable, very difficult, and yet it's necessary. Knowing that, ask yourself this first today. Simply, are you willing, like Jesus, are you willing to enter into this place in your life? Because if you'll do that, then what Jesus found to be true is what you will always find to be true. That this place you find to be so daunting, man, if you'll just enter into it and you'll clear some space for God within it, then this place that seems so daunting will become, one of the best places in your life because God begins to work there in such incredible ways. Again, are you willing to, we might say, open yourself to that possibility? God healing you, growing you, guiding you, because you're willing to enter in. Are you willing to, we might say, at least open yourself to that possibility as a first part of your journey into Lent? So that's the first thing I want us to grab onto today. Not an easy thing to do. Let's acknowledge that. But then there's a second thing that's important for us to understand as well. Secondly, in order to make the most of this season of Lent, secondly, we've got to do this. Once in our wilderness, are you ready? Again, 40 days, we can't do an hour in there, right? Once in our wilderness, another thing we got to claim today is we got to then be willing to stay there for a while. Once we enter in, good for us that we've taken that step with God's help. But then once there, we've really got to spend some time there. And why is that? Because the work we need to do there, that work's going to take some time, right? As does anything that's a part of our being a follower of Jesus Christ. One of the gifts that Lent brings to us is, in fact, this very thing, right? Brings to us some time, 40 days to be exact. And while that might not be enough time to deal with all the things you find and want to deal with in the midst of that wilderness experience, while that might not be enough time to deal with everything, if we just embrace it anyway, man, we'll be able to at least create a little bit of space for God, begin to deal with a few things anyway. And man, if we'll even just do that, transformation, spiritual growth, again, healing and wholeness, potentially, that can be ours. God beginning to change everything for us as we've given him a chance to work in a place where we most need him. Again, one of the things we can never, ever emphasize enough, one of the things we can never say enough when it comes to our spiritual journey is this. Man, it takes time to grow in our faith. Man, it takes time to work through some of the difficult things that battle within us. Man, it takes time to fully surrender our lives to God. And actually, when it comes to that last thing, it takes a lifetime, doesn't it? In a culture that oftentimes tells us, do not slow down, you got things to do. In a culture that often says, do not pause, you don't need to reflect. Man, in a culture like that, this can be a really hard thing to do. And yet, however hard it might be, what do we know to be true? Even as Jesus did this, we need to do this as well. Ask yourself, secondly, today, as you allow the Spirit to lead you into your wilderness, as you work at entering into your wilderness, so that good things might happen there, are you willing to stay there long enough so that change can come about? And again, while 40 days, maybe that doesn't seem like a very long time, as we said earlier, great place to start, to begin to at least chip away at some of the things you need to work on with God's help. And then there's a final part of laying this foundation today. Guys, if we will allow ourselves to be driven into the wilderness, if we'll then be willing to spend some time there, if we'll do that, then here are some things that we will find in the wilderness. And while there will be nuances to this for all of us, while there will be some things that will be unique for you, I mean, these are main categories, though, that will bring up some of those things, that will be the same for all of us. I think it's helpful, again, to think of these ahead of time so that we can be better prepared for them, better prepared to work on them. So here are some things you'll find in the wilderness. A first thing that you'll find there, or a first thing that you'll encounter, and this absolutely is the first thing that Jesus encountered as well. First thing you're going to encounter there is temptation, right? And one of the beautiful things about clearing space for God in that wilderness, where temptation resides, but also where us failing to resist temptation resides, that which can create so much guilt. The beautiful thing about that temptation being brought to light in our wilderness is that, obvious as it sounds, now we can begin to work on it. Truly bring it to God and work on such things, however deep some of them might run. Guys, one of the things that I want you to always remember, there is no temptation that you can bring to God. There is no temptation that you're failing at. There is no temptation you're giving into. There is no temptation you feel so guilty about. Nothing you can bring to God that's gonna bring about Him being angry, Him being disappointed in you. Instead, you know where the disappointment creeps in? When we act like we're not tempted. When we bury the temptation, the failure at times, not even reaching out to say, God, let me be honest with you, I need your help. That's where the disappointment can creep in for God. And so first, as you begin to make your way into the wilderness this week, just quieting your heart, listening for God. First, as you do that this week, consider what temptations initially come to mind. And then as you process through those temptations, and maybe even failure to resist, as you process through all of that, then consider, how can I best give those things to God? How can I best clear sacred space for God in the midst of those things? That together we might work on them. I might be stronger in resisting them. Another thing we'll find in the wilderness is just a whole lot of emotion. To be honest, sometimes just really, really raw emotion. For example, when we take the time to enter into that place where struggle and weakness and temptation reside, then of course, makes sense, of course, in that place, we're going to find at times some anger that hasn't been resolved, some insecurity that we're trying to work through, some worry, some anxiety that's getting in our way, whatever it might be, though. When we feel that emotion, that raw emotion in that place, we've got to always just acknowledge it, and we've just got to say to God, God, what do these emotions say about who I am right now and how I desperately need you in my life? Or God, what do these emotions most say to me about what are they supposed to say to me about where I am in my faith right now? And I especially need your help when it comes to me growing in my faith, getting stronger in my faith. So in the wilderness, we're going to find temptation. We're going to find emotion that we've got to not allow to deter us. But then we're also going to find this, thank goodness. Are you ready for some good news? There's something good we'll find in the wilderness as well. If we clear some sacred space there. Yeah, we'll find temptation. We'll find deep emotion. But we'll also find this, and Jesus certainly found this as well, this coming to him in the form of some angels who came to care for him. Guys, if you'll let the Spirit drive you into the wilderness, then as much as you will find struggle there, you will also, though, find this, the gift of positive and nurturing relationships. Or the gift of incredible people, think of it this way, the gift of incredible people who are willing to walk with you in the wilderness when you need it most. That means even as you open yourself up to the work you need to do there, and I hope you'll really begin to process that this week, today, in the days that follow. Even as you open yourself up to the work that needs to be done there, and make sure you also open your eyes to the reality of those people who are ready to help you with that work. Guys, today we begin a journey to the cross. We begin a journey to the empty tomb. We begin a journey to Jesus' death and resurrection. And so as we do that, entering into this time of potentially just great transformation and change in us, as we do that, I want to encourage you early on in this season, first Sunday of Lent, I want to encourage you to commit yourself to a spiritual practice, a Lenten practice. I want to invite the band to come up on stage as we just begin to think through, so what might those Lenten practices look like for you? What might they be for you? For example, some of you might say, I think what could help me most would be a daily prayer time, right? I think if I continue to live out my daily prayer time, I'm going to hear God's voice better. I'm going to create space for him in the midst of my wilderness. I think that'll be great. As I mention that, some of you are going to say, gosh, Rob, I've been doing that for years. Already have a daily prayer time. And then when I push you to look back a little bit, you go, oh gosh, I guess I've been participating in a daily prayer time, maybe once a week. It's not a daily prayer time, is it? So for you, you might say, gosh, how can I really, really prioritize this? What would it mean for me, over the next 40 days to just really go deep into a prayer time, drawing God in to where I need him most? Some of you might say, and I want you to think creatively about this as well. You may have some very creative ways to clear that space in your wilderness. Some of you might say journaling can help you with that. Others of you might say, I go for a walk every day. I walk for 20 minutes, 30 minutes, 45 minutes, an hour for some of you. I know that's the case. So why not make that a more meditative walk in the midst of this season, where using maybe the devotional guide that we've created for you this year, staff and laity writing some beautiful devotions. I want to thank you guys already for how blessed I've been by the first 4 I've read so far. Incredible. Dr. Bob and Marcia and Lori, thank you so much. So I want to encourage you, maybe you read a daily devotion before you walk, and then you get into just one of those things, and you say, this helps me just to think about this, work through this. Maybe, I'm going to talk about studies in a moment, but maybe something you pull out of a study, a Sunday school class, you say, I want to focus on this in the midst of walking, something like that. Others of you, though, might say, I haven't done a study before. I haven't done a class before. Even now, whether in person or online, you might say, it will really help me during this season of Lent. even if you were to say, I'll at least prioritize these next 5 or 6 weeks, man, that could change everything for you. Know that Laura Rector, our new director of discipleship, she started a study last Thursday, a study for Lent that can draw you deeply into this walk. It can be a part of clearing space for God in the midst of your wilderness. So I encourage you, even if you missed last week, I assure you, don't worry about that. Come the next 5. Let us know. This is in person in our Sunday school class. If you don't know for sure where that is, call the office. We'll guide you there. But if you want to do that, then consider that. I will have a study starting this Wednesday. It'll be a 10 a.m. Zoom meeting if you want to be a part of that. Some of you may say, I'm still not comfortable coming back, so you'd rather do a Zoom meeting. We're going to be working off of what we've been talking about in worship, and we'll do that each week. But I want to just encourage you, consider one of those. I think that could be a great blessing to you. And let me just say as an aside, one of the beautiful things about Scripture, there are times when people don't want to acknowledge that, of course, there are differences in the Bible that we find in different translations, in different Gospels. One of the beautiful things about our studies, and Laura and I haven't talked about this, but it's so great. In some translations, in some Gospels, the wilderness is what? It's a desert. And that's what she's focused on in her study. In other places, it's called a wilderness. I don't know why I've always thought of that as more, a wilderness area where there are going to be trees and we're going to make our way through it, find ourselves in it. Both are powerful images, but I say that just because it's beautiful that we're kind of looking at that in 2 different ways. What might really help you? Spiritual practice, Lenten practice. What might really help you to enter your wilderness, clear space for God there, and really begin to do the work that you need to do? Maybe work you've always wanted to do, each Lent even, but you've just never done it. Take something like that on. Commit to it today. Always, though, remembering why you are doing it. You're doing it so that throughout these 40 days, more and more, you might begin to clear space for God where you need Him most. We remember as we close, Jesus is not just called into the wilderness, He was driven there by the Spirit. He needed that time. Oh my goodness. Certainly, therefore, we need it as well. Begin to explore that today, this week. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.